October 7th, 1950. Kim Il-sung was in a command bunker somewhere north of Pyongyang, the exact location kept secret even from most of his own generals, when the reports started coming in. American and South Korean forces had crossed the 38th parallel. They were advancing into North Korea, the war that Kim had started just 3.5 months earlier, with such confidence, such certainty of quick victory, had turned into a catastrophic disaster. And now the enemy was coming for him. Kim sat at a rough wooden table covered with maps, his face showing the strain of the past weeks. He was 38 years old, the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, hand-picked by Stalin to rule the northern half of the divided Korean peninsula. He had spent years in the Soviet Union, had fought with Soviet forces in World War II, spoke fluent Russian, and modeled himself after Stalin in every way: the cult of personality, the ruthless purges of rivals, the absolute control over every aspect of government and society. But unlike Stalin, Kim Il-sung had made a catastrophic miscalculation, and now he was paying the price. Around him in the bunker were his top military commanders and political advisors, all looking grim. The maps on the table told the story. North Korean forces, which had swept down the peninsula in June and July, capturing Seoul and pushing South Korean and American forces into a tiny perimeter around Pusan, had been driven back in a stunning reversal. The American landing at Inchon in September had cut North Korean supply lines, and the breakout from the Pusan perimeter had shattered the North Korean army. In just 3 weeks, the tide of the war had completely turned. And now, with UN authorization and against Chinese and Soviet warnings, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur were crossing the 38th parallel, the boundary between North and South Korea, and advancing toward Pyongyang. "How long until they reach the capital?" Kim asked, his voice carefully controlled. He had learned from Stalin never to show weakness, never to reveal doubt or fear, even when disaster loomed. General Cho Yong-gon, the North Korean defense minister, consulted his notes. At their current rate of advance, American forces could reach Pyongyang within 2 weeks, perhaps sooner if our defensive lines collapse. "And will they collapse?" Kim asked sharply. The silence in the bunker was answer enough. The North Korean People's Army, which had numbered nearly 200,000 well-equipped troops in June, had been decimated. Tens of thousands were dead, wounded, or captured. Thousands more had deserted or been cut off behind enemy lines. The survivors were exhausted, demoralized, short of ammunition and supplies. They would not hold against the American advance. "Comrade General Secretary," said Pak Hon-yong, Kim's foreign minister and the leader of the Southern Communist faction, "we must request immediate assistance from the Soviet Union and China. Without their direct military intervention, we cannot stop the Americans." Kim's jaw tightened. Asking for help was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement that his grand plan to reunify Korea under communist rule had collapsed. But Pa was right. Without Soviet or Chinese intervention, North Korea would be conquered, and Kim himself would be killed or captured. "I've already sent urgent messages to Comrade Stalin and to Chairman Mao," Kim said. "I've explained the situation and requested military support." "And what have they said?" Pak asked. Kim's expression darkened. "Stalin has expressed sympathy but says the Soviet Union cannot directly intervene without risking war with the United States. He has promised to provide weapons and supplies, but no Soviet troops." "And Mao?" "Mao is considering his options," Kim said carefully. The truth was more complicated and more troubling. The Chinese had been warning Kim for months not to provoke the Americans, not to give them an excuse to intervene in Korea. And when Kim had launched his invasion anyway, the Chinese had been furious. Now, with American forces approaching the Chinese border, Mao was facing a terrible choice: intervene and risk war with America, or stand aside and watch a hostile American army establish itself on China's doorstep. Kim stood up and walked to the map, staring at the arrows showing American advances. This wasn't supposed to happen, he said quietly. The invasion was supposed to be quick, decisive. We were supposed to liberate the South before the Americans could intervene effectively. We were supposed to reunify Korea under socialist rule and present the world with a fait accompli. Instead, he continued, his voice bitter, the Americans landed at Inchon, cut our supply lines and destroyed our army, and now they're invading the North and there's nothing we can do to stop them. He turned to face his advisors. Do you know what I told Stalin when I asked for permission to invade? I told him the Americans wouldn't intervene. I told him they had written off Korea as outside their defense perimeter. I told him that even if they did intervene, the war would be over before they could mobilize effectively. I told him victory was certain. Kim laughed bitterly. Victory was certain, and Stalin believed me. He gave me weapons, he gave me advisors, he gave me permission to launch the invasion, and I was so confident, so sure of success, that I ignored all the warnings, all the risks, all the possibility that things could go wrong. Comrade General Secretary, General Cho said carefully, the initial invasion was successful. We captured Seoul, we drove the South Korean army to the brink of collapse, we nearly pushed the Americans into the sea at Busan. The plan was working. Until Inchon, Kim said flatly. Until MacArthur did something brilliant and unexpected, and our entire strategy collapsed. Until the Americans showed that they were willing to commit whatever forces were necessary to defend South Korea and defeat us. He walked back to the table and sat down heavily. I underestimated them. I underestimated American resolve, American military capability, American willingness to fight for Korea. I thought they were weak, that they had been softened by peace and prosperity, that they wouldn't have the stomach for a war in Asia so soon after World War II. I was wrong, Kim said quietly. And now North Korea is paying the price for my mistake. Park Hon-young spoke up, his voice urgent. Comrade General Secretary, we must focus on the present situation, not on past mistakes. The Americans are crossing the 38th parallel. If they capture Pyongyang, if they conquer all of North Korea, then everything we've built will be destroyed. We need a plan. Kim looked at him sharply. A plan? What kind of plan? Our army is shattered. The Soviets won't intervene. The Chinese are still deciding. What exactly do you propose we do? We must evacuate Pyongyang, Park said. Move the government north, toward the Chinese border. Prepare for guerrilla warfare if necessary, and we must continue pressuring Mao to intervene. If Chinese forces enter the war, we can still drive the Americans back. Evacuate Pyongyang, Kim repeated slowly. The capital of North Korea, the city he had ruled from for 5 years, the symbol of his power and authority. Abandoning it would be a devastating blow to morale, an admission of defeat visible to everyone. But Pa was right. If they stayed in Pyongyang, they would be captured or killed when the Americans arrived. Very well, Kim said finally. Begin preparations to evacuate the government to Kangye, near the Chinese border. Move essential personnel and equipment. Destroy anything that might be useful to the Americans, and send another urgent message to Mao. Tell him that if China doesn't intervene immediately, North Korea will cease to exist and American forces will be on the Chinese border. As his advisors hurried to implement these orders, Kim remained at the table, staring at the maps. The arrows showing American advances seemed to mock him. Arrows pointing north toward Pyongyang, toward the Chinese border, toward the complete conquest of North Korea. How had it come to this? How had his certain victory turned into catastrophic defeat? Kim thought back to the beginning, to the months of planning and preparation before the invasion. He had been so confident, so sure that history was on his side. The Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany. The Communists had won the Chinese Civil War. Communist movements were gaining strength around the world. It seemed obvious that Korea would be reunified under communist rule. It was just a matter of when and how. And Kim had been determined to be the one to do it, to be the leader who reunified Korea. who would be remembered as the founder of a united Korean socialist state. He had spent months lobbying Stalin for permission to invade. At first, Stalin had been cautious, worried about provoking the Americans. But Kim had been persistent, arguing that the correlation of forces favored North Korea, that the South Korean army was weak and unpopular, that the Americans wouldn't intervene or couldn't intervene effectively. Finally, in early 1950, Stalin had given his approval, conditional on Mao also agreeing. Kim had traveled to Beijing, had convinced Mao that victory was certain, that the war would be over quickly, that American intervention was unlikely. And on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces had crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The initial success had been intoxicating. South Korean forces had collapsed. Seoul had fallen in 3 days. The North Korean army had swept down the peninsula, seemingly unstoppable. By early August, South Korean and American forces had been pushed into a small perimeter around the port city of Busan, and it looked like complete victory was just weeks away. Kim had been euphoric. He had given speeches about the imminent liberation of the South, about the reunification of Korea, about the triumph of socialism over capitalism. He had imagined himself as the leader of a united Korea, standing alongside Stalin and Mao as one of the great communist leaders of the age. But then everything had gone wrong. The Americans had held at Busan, had built up their forces, had prepared for a counter-offensive. And on September 15th, MacArthur had launched his audacious landing at Inchon, far behind North Korean lines, cutting supply routes and threatening to encircle the entire North Korean army. Within days, the North Korean position had become untenable. Forces at Busan had broken out of the perimeter. Forces at Inchon had driven inland. The North Korean army, overextended and undersupplied, had begun to disintegrate. And now, just 3 weeks after Inchon, American forces were crossing the 38th parallel and invading North Korea. A young officer entered the bunker and approached Kim nervously. "Comrade General Secretary, we have a communication from Beijing. Chairman Mao wishes to speak with you urgently." Kim's heart leaped. Perhaps Mao had decided to intervene. Perhaps Chinese forces would enter the war and drive the Americans back. Perhaps there was still hope. "Put him through," Kim ordered. The radio connection was poor. Static and interference made it difficult to hear clearly. But Mao's voice came through, speaking in Chinese that Kim understood reasonably well from his years working with Chinese communists. "Comrade Kim," Mao said, his tone formal and cold, "I have received your urgent requests for Chinese military intervention. I have discussed this matter with my colleagues in the Politburo, and we have made a decision." Kim held his breath. "China will intervene," Mao said. "We cannot allow American forces to reach the Yalu River, cannot allow a hostile army to establish itself on our border. We will send Chinese People's Volunteers to Korea to fight alongside your forces." Relief flooded through Kim. "Comrade Chairman, thank you. China's intervention will turn the tide of the war. Together, we can drive the Americans back across the 38th parallel and—" "However," Mao interrupted, his voice hard, "you must understand something, Comrade Kim. China is intervening to protect Chinese security, not to save your regime. We are entering this war because American forces approaching our border threaten China, not because we approve of your reckless invasion that provoked this crisis." Kim was silent, stung by Mao's rebuke. "We warned you," Mao continued. "We told you not to provoke the Americans, not to give them an excuse to intervene in Korea. We told you that your invasion was premature, that the risks were too great, but you ignored our warnings. You were so confident of quick victory that you didn't consider what would happen if things went wrong." "And now things have gone wrong," Mao said, his voice heavy with disapproval. "Your army has been destroyed, your country is being invaded, and China must risk war with America to prevent a disaster on our border, a disaster that you created." "Comrade Chairman," Kim said, trying to keep his voice steady, I acknowledge that the situation has developed unfavorably, but with Chinese intervention, we can still achieve victory. We can drive the Americans back, Mao interrupted again. We can restore the 38th parallel as the boundary between North and South. But Comrade Kim, you must abandon any dreams of conquering South Korea. That opportunity is gone. Your invasion failed. The best we can hope for now is to restore the status quo ante, to return to the situation before your ill-advised invasion. The words hit Kim like physical blows. Restore the status quo ante. Return to the divided Korea that had existed before June 25th. Accept that his grand plan to reunify Korea had not just failed, but had failed catastrophically at enormous cost in lives and destruction. I understand, Kim said quietly. I hope you do, Mao said. Because Chinese soldiers are going to die fighting your war, Comrade Kim. Thousands of them, perhaps hundreds of thousands. They will be fighting to save your regime from the consequences of your own mistakes. You owe them, and China, a debt that can never be fully repaid. After the call ended, Kim sat in silence, Mao's words echoing in his mind. The Chinese would intervene, which meant North Korea would survive, but at what cost? Chinese soldiers dying by the thousands. North Korea reduced to a Chinese client state, dependent on Beijing's support. Kim himself diminished from the bold leader who would reunify Korea to the reckless fool who had provoked a catastrophic war and had to be rescued by China. General Cho spoke up carefully. Comrade General Secretary, the Chinese intervention is good news. With Chinese forces entering the war, we can stop the American advance. Yes, Kim said dully. We can stop them. We can drive them back to the 38th parallel. And then we'll have a stalemate, a frozen conflict, a divided Korea just like before. Except that hundreds of thousands of people will have died, cities will be in ruins, and Korea will be devastated. He looked around at his advisors. Do you understand what this means? It means we've achieved nothing. Worse than nothing, we've destroyed our country and made ourselves dependent on Chinese protection. All my plans, all my confidence, all my certainty that we would reunify Korea under socialist rule, all of it was for nothing. Park Hon-young said carefully, Comrade General Secretary, we should not be too pessimistic. Yes, the situation is difficult, but North Korea will survive. The revolution will continue. And in time, perhaps in another generation, we may have another opportunity to reunify Korea. Kim looked at him sharply. Another opportunity? After this disaster, after we've shown the world that we started a war we couldn't win, that we had to be rescued by China, that our military was defeated and our country invaded? Who will trust us with another opportunity? He stood up abruptly. No, Park Hon-young. There will be no another opportunity, not in my lifetime, probably not for generations. Korea will remain divided, and that division is my responsibility. I started this war. I promised Stalin and Mao that victory was certain. I led North Korea into this catastrophe. And now, Kim continued, his voice heavy with bitterness, I will spend the rest of my life trying to rebuild what I destroyed, trying to maintain my power in a country that will be economically devastated and militarily dependent on China. That is my legacy. That is what I achieved with my invasion. The bunker fell silent. No one knew what to say. Kim Il-sung, the great leader, the founding father of North Korea, was acknowledging his failure, his miscalculation, his responsibility for the catastrophe that had befallen his country. But even as he acknowledged it privately, Kim knew that publicly he could never admit it. The cult of personality he had built around himself, modeled after Stalin's, required that he be infallible, that he be always right, that any failures be blamed on others, on saboteurs, on American imperialism, on bad luck, on anything except his own mistakes. So publicly, Kim would blame the Americans for crossing the 38th parallel, would claim that North Korea had been the victim of unprovoked aggression, would rewrite the history of the war to make himself the heroic defender rather than the reckless aggressor. But privately, in this bunker, in this moment, Kim Il-sung understood the truth. He had started a war he couldn't win, had destroyed his own country, and had achieved nothing except death and devastation. Over the following weeks, events unfolded as Mao had promised. Chinese forces, officially called volunteers, to maintain the fiction that China wasn't directly at war with the United States, poured across the Yalu River into North Korea. In late October and November, they launched massive attacks against American and UN forces, catching them by surprise and driving them back in chaotic retreat. The war that had seemed nearly over, with American victory imminent, suddenly became a new and different conflict. Chinese intervention transformed the Korean War from a limited conflict to punish North Korean aggression into a grinding, brutal stalemate that would last for nearly 3 more years. Kim Il-sung evacuated Pyongyang before American forces arrived, moved his government to Kangye near the Chinese border, and watched as Chinese forces did what his own army could not: stop the American advance and eventually push them back south of the 38th parallel. By early 1951, the front lines had stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel where they had started. The war continued for 2 more years, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory, until an armistice was finally signed in July 1953. Korea remained divided. Millions of people had died, perhaps 3 million, including civilians. Cities were in ruins, families were separated. And the division that Kim Il-sung had sought to end through military force was now more permanent, more militarized, more hostile than ever. In the decades that followed, Kim built North Korea into one of the most repressive states in the world, maintained power through brutal purges and an elaborate cult of personality, and remained completely dependent on Chinese and Soviet support. He never admitted his responsibility for the catastrophic war, never acknowledged his miscalculation, never expressed regret for the death and destruction his invasion had caused. But on October 7th, 1950, in that bunker north of Pyongyang, watching American forces cross the 38th parallel and advance toward his capital, Kim Il-sung had understood the truth. He had gambled and lost. He had started a war with confidence of quick victory and instead had brought catastrophe to his country. He had promised to reunify Korea and instead had ensured its permanent division. He had sought to establish himself as a great revolutionary leader and instead had become dependent on Chinese intervention to save his regime. And when the reports came in that American troops were crossing the 38th parallel, advancing into North Korea, threatening to conquer the entire country and destroy his regime, Kim Il-sung had said, not out loud, not to his advisors, but to himself, in the privacy of his own thoughts, "I have destroyed my country, I have failed my people, I have brought catastrophe where I promised victory, and now I must depend on China to save me from the consequences of my own mistakes. This is my fault, all of it. The death, the destruction, the suffering. I started this war. I was so confident, so certain of victory, so sure that history was on my side, and I was wrong. And I will spend the rest of my life pretending I wasn't wrong, building a cult of personality to hide my failure, rewriting history to make myself the hero rather than the villain of this catastrophe. Because I cannot admit the truth. I cannot acknowledge my mistakes. I cannot accept responsibility for what I've done. So I will lie. I will blame the Americans. I will claim we were the victims. I will build a mythology around myself as the great leader who defended Korea against imperialism. But I will always know the truth. I will always remember this moment when American troops crossed the 38th parallel, when my country was being invaded, when I had to beg China to save me. I will always know that I failed. That was what Kim Il-sung said when American troops crossed the 38th parallel. Not publicly, not officially, not in any speech or statement, but privately, in his heart, in the moment before he began the decades-long process of denial and myth-making that would define his rule. He knew he had failed. That knowledge, buried deep beneath layers of propaganda and personality cult, would haunt him for the rest of his life.